If you were born in ancient Rome, this is how you'd get rich. You were born in the wrong century. Not because Rome was glorious, not because of the gladiators or the aqueducts or the marble temples that made every city on earth look primitive by comparison, but because Rome had something modern economies have spent 2,000 years trying to recreate. A wealth-building system so simple, so brutal, so mathematically inevitable that the men who understood it didn't just get rich. They got generational, empire-spanning, history book rich. And almost none of them did it the way you've been taught. Not by winning battles, not by inheriting land, not by being born into the right family, though that helped. They did it by understanding one truth that Rome made undeniable and that modern economies obscure behind complexity and regulation, and the illusion of equal opportunity. Wealth in Rome didn't come from working harder. It came from owning the things that made other people work. That's the whole system. 4 words. Own the productive assets. And Rome, for all its brutality, for all its inequality, for all the ways it would horrify a modern human being, made this system more transparent than any economy before or since. Because Rome didn't pretend there was another way. Rome didn't tell its citizens that hard work and virtue would make them rich. Rome told them the truth. You want wealth? Own land. Own slaves. Own the contracts that supply the army. Own the silver mines. Own the ships. Own the grain warehouses. Own the tax collection rights in an entire province. And if you're clever, if you're ruthless, if you understand the system before everyone else does, you can start with almost nothing and end up owning half a province. Let me show you exactly how they did it. Not the myths, not the sanitized textbook version, the actual mechanisms, the actual playbook, because the men who got rich in Rome followed a sequence. A specific, documented, historically verified sequence. And once you see it, you'll recognize every piece of it in the modern world, because the system didn't die with Rome. It evolved, and you're living inside it right now. First, understand where you're starting. You were born in Rome. Let's say around 100 BC, the late Republic, the most interesting and dangerous period in Roman history. A time when fortunes were being made and lost faster than any period before the Industrial Revolution. A time when the rules were written in real time and the men who wrote them got rich. What does your starting position look like? If you're patrician, if your family traces its lineage to the original Roman families, you have advantages. Access to the Senate, social connections, the presumption of trustworthiness that Roman business ran on. But you're also constrained. Patrician tradition forbade direct involvement in trade. You couldn't be seen haggling at the docks or counting coins in a warehouse, beneath your dignity. If you're a plebeian, if you're a free Roman citizen of common birth, you have none of those advantages. But you have none of those constraints either. You can trade. You can contract. You can hustle in ways a patrician senator never could. If you're a freedman, a former slave who has been manumitted, you have almost nothing. A small gift from your former master, perhaps. A marketable skill, and a burning understanding of exactly how the system works because you've spent years inside it as property. Ironically, the freedmen were often the most dangerous wealth builders in Rome, because they had nothing to lose and everything to understand. We'll come back to them. But here's the universal truth about your starting position regardless of your birth. Rome in 100 BC is about to go through the most violent, most disruptive, most wealth-generating restructuring in its history. The Republic is cracking. The old rules are breaking. Land is being seized and redistributed. Wars are creating new provinces, new resources, new opportunities. Political chaos is the highest return investment environment in history. Fortunes are not preserved in moments like this. They're created, and the first step to creating one is understanding the foundational asset. Stage 1. The land. Everything in Rome begins with land. Not metaphorically, literally. Land is the only asset the Roman elite universally agreed was legitimate. Land produced grain, which fed cities. Land produced olives, which produced oil, which lit every lamp in the Mediterranean. Land produced grapes, which produced wine, which was the lubricant of every Roman social relationship, every deal, every alliance. Land was the Roman stock market, except it paid dividends every harvest, held its value across generations, and could be used as collateral for loans to buy more land. Here's the mechanism the wealthy Romans understood that you need to understand. The Roman Republic had a concept called the ager publicus, public land. Land conquered from enemies of Rome that technically belonged to the Roman people collectively. In theory, it was supposed to be distributed to small farmers. In practice, wealthy Romans simply occupied it. They moved their cattle and slaves onto public land, paid a nominal grazing fee, and effectively owned it. The Gracchi brothers tried to fix this in the 130s and 120s BC. They wanted to redistribute the ager publicus to poor Romans. The Senate had them killed. That's how important the land was. But here's where the opportunity was for someone paying attention. The Gracchian crisis created chaos. Large landowners who had been illegally occupying public land suddenly faced legal challenges. Some were nervous, some were selling, and the prices were depressed because of the uncertainty. This is the first pattern of Roman wealth building. Buy when others are selling from fear. The men who understood that the Senate would ultimately protect property rights, because senators were property owners, bought land during the crisis. They bought it cheap, held it, and watched it appreciate as the political situation stabilized. But owning land alone doesn't make you rich. Land is the foundation. The machine that runs on it is what creates the wealth, and the machine was the villa system. The Roman villa wasn't a country house, not in the way we romanticize it. A Roman villa was an agricultural production facility, a factory farm, a vertically integrated food production and processing operation that would have impressed any modern agribusiness executive. A productive villa had grain fields worked by slaves, olive groves with their own pressing equipment to produce oil on site, vineyards with wine production facilities attached, livestock for wool, for meat, for the plow animals that worked the fields, and frequently secondary industries attached. A pottery workshop making amphorae to ship the wine and oil, a mill processing grain not just from the villa's own fields but from neighboring farms for a fee. The Roman agricultural writer Columella wrote a detailed manual on how to run one of these operations. It reads like a business school textbook. Optimize your slave workforce for efficiency. Diversify your crops to hedge against weather. Invest in infrastructure that reduces your per-unit costs. The analytics were Roman, but the logic is permanent. Now here's the wealth-building insight. A productive villa generated cash surpluses every year. And those surpluses, if you weren't an idiot, weren't consumed. They were reinvested into another plot of land, into more slaves, into better equipment, into the next investment vehicle that Rome offered to those with capital. Marcus Licinius Crassus understood this sequence better than anyone who ever lived. Crassus was born around 115 BC to a patrician family that had fallen from wealth. His father's property was confiscated during the political purges of the 80s BC. Crassus escaped with almost nothing. He came back with everything. At his peak, Crassus was worth 200 million sesterces. To put that in perspective, the annual Roman state budget was around 200 million sesterces. Crassus was worth a year of the entire Roman government. He was the richest private individual in Roman history. How did he do it? First step. He went to Spain during his exile and rebuilt his capital through silver mining. Rome controlled the Spanish silver mines, but leasing rights could be purchased. Mining was dirty, dangerous, socially looked down upon by the patrician class. That snobbishness created opportunity for Crassus. He leased the rights. He worked slave labor in the mines. He accumulated capital. Silver mining in Spain was producing the equivalent of billions of dollars annually. Crassus took his cut. He came back to Rome with capital, and then he did something that should be studied in every finance class ever taught. He bought the burning buildings. Rome in the late Republic had no fire department. When a building caught fire, it burned. And in Rome's dense residential districts, one fire could consume an entire block of insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that housed most of Rome's population. Crassus organized a team, hundreds of trained slaves. When a fire broke out, Crassus's team would arrive at the scene, not to fight the fire immediately. First, to negotiate. While the building burned, while the desperate owner watched his property turn to ash, Crassus would approach and offer to buy, at fire sale prices, literally. The owner could take a fraction of the property's value right now, or watch it burn to nothing. Most sold. Then Crassus's slave team would extinguish the fire. Crassus would rebuild, and Crassus would own a prime piece of Roman real estate that he'd acquired for almost nothing. This is one of the most ruthless wealth-building strategies in history, and it was perfectly legal, because Rome had no regulation preventing it. But here's what's more important than the brutality: the insight behind it. Crassus understood that in a city with no fire department, fire risk was a permanent discount on urban property values. Everyone in Rome was underpricing city real estate because everyone feared losing it to fire. Crassus, by controlling the fire suppression infrastructure, eliminated that risk for himself. He could value property at full value when no one else could. The information advantage and the operational capability created arbitrage that made him impossible to compete with. This is the pattern. Find the discount that exists because of a risk everyone fears. Solve the risk. Buy the asset at the discount. Collect the premium. Stage 2. The contracts. Land makes you wealthy in Rome. Contracts make you powerful. And in Rome, powerful and wealthy were the same word. The Roman state was not a modern government. It didn't have a bureaucracy that could manage complex logistics. When Rome needed something done, it auctioned off the contracts. Publicani, tax farmers. The system worked like this. Rome controlled provinces across the Mediterranean. Those provinces owed taxes to Rome, but Rome didn't have the staff to collect those taxes directly. So Rome auctioned the collection rights. A company of wealthy investors would bid on the right to collect taxes in, say, the province of Asia. They'd pay Rome a guaranteed sum up front. Then they'd go collect the actual taxes. Whatever they collected above what they paid Rome was their profit. The risk was enormous. If a province was struck by drought or war, the tax farmers still owed Rome their guaranteed payment. They'd lose everything. But in a good year, in a stable province, the profit margins were extraordinary. The Publicani were the private equity firms of the ancient world. They pooled capital. They managed risk across multiple provincial contracts. They used political connections to win favorable auctions. And they used their wealth to buy more political connections to win more favorable auctions. Cicero understood this. Julius Caesar understood this. Marcus Crassus built his empire on this. The Publicani weren't just businessmen. They were a political force. You couldn't govern Rome without them, and they knew it. If you were born in Rome and you wanted to get rich, you got yourself inside a publican company. You pooled your capital with partners. You bid on contracts, and you collected. The income from provincial tax collection made Roman investors rich in a way that had no modern equivalent except perhaps early-stage private equity. The returns were extraordinary. The risks were real. The political connections required were significant. But the men who navigated it accumulated wealth that compounded across generations. Stage 3. The money. Here's the thing about ancient Rome that most people don't understand. It had a sophisticated, complex, and thoroughly modern financial system. Rome had banks, not metaphorical banks. Actual institutions called argentariae, run by men called argentarii. The silver men, who took deposits, made loans, cleared payments between merchants and made a spread on every transaction. Rome had credit. Loans at interest were fundamental to how Roman commerce and agriculture functioned. The standard interest rate was 12% per year, 1% per month, which doesn't sound outrageous until you realize that with compound interest and Roman enforcement mechanisms, which included debt slavery until relatively late in the Republic, unpaid loans had a way of becoming catastrophic for borrowers. And here's the insight that Rome made visible and that modern financial systems obscure with complexity. The most reliable path to wealth in any economy is to be the lender rather than the borrower. In Rome, this was even more naked than in the modern world. You lent money. You charged interest. The borrower paid you every month. You compounded those payments into new loans. And your capital grew mathematically, automatically, without labor, without innovation, without anything except the initial capital and the discipline to reinvest the returns. Titus Pomponius Atticus, Cicero's best friend and correspondent, built one of the great Roman fortunes almost entirely through lending. He was not a senator. He was not a general. He did not win battles or govern provinces. He lent money at interest to senators and generals and governors who constantly needed it. His secret was what we would now call diversification and credit quality. Atticus was meticulous about who he lent to. He preferred lending to men of high social standing because their reputations required them to repay. He was not the cheapest lender in Rome. He was the most reliable counterparty. And he charged accordingly. Senators borrowed from Atticus to run their political campaigns. Generals borrowed from Atticus to equip their legions when the state was slow to pay. Governors borrowed from Atticus to maintain their lifestyles in their provinces. And Atticus collected interest from all of them, reliably, for decades, until he was worth more than most of the men who borrowed from him. This is the second great pattern of Roman wealth. Lend to the powerful, because the powerful have the most to lose by defaulting. Their reputation, their political career, their social position, all depend on being seen as men who honor their debts. Stage 4. The network. Here is where most people studying Roman wealth miss the critical piece. They look at the land, the mines, the contracts, the loans, and they think the wealth came from the assets themselves. It didn't. The wealth came from the network that gave access to the assets. Rome ran on personal relationships in a way that no modern economy does. The concept was called amicitia, friendship, but it wasn't friendship in the way you think of it. It was a formal, reciprocal relationship of obligation. If someone was your amicus, your friend, you owed each other favors. Economic favors, political favors, social favors. If you had a contract to bid on and you needed capital, you went to your amici. If you had surplus capital and needed a reliable investment, you went to your amici. If you needed someone to speak for you in court, to vouch for your creditworthiness to a banker, to introduce you to the governor of a profitable province, you went to your amici. The Roman network was the operating system. The land, the contracts, the loans were the applications running on top of it. And here's how you built the network, if you were a nobody starting from nothing. You attached yourself to a great man. The Latin word was cliens. Client. You were his client. He was your patron. You showed up at his door every morning during the salutatio, the ritual morning greeting, along with every other client. You accompanied him through the forum. You cheered for him in public. You voted for him and his allies in the assemblies. You carried out small tasks he needed done. In return, he gave you access to his contracts, to his lending relationships, to his introductions, to his legal protection, to the entire web of his own amici, which became partially available to you by extension. This is the Roman intern, the Roman apprenticeship, the Roman version of starting at the bottom of the right firm. The men who got rich in Rome did not start out with great men's resources. They started out with great men's proximity. And proximity, leveraged correctly over years, converted into resources. Cicero was born in Arpinum, a provincial town, to a family of modest equestrian status. No ancestral connection to the great Roman families. No family wealth to speak of. By the time he was the most famous orator in Rome, by the time he was consul, the highest office in the Republic, he had built a network that connected him to every major political and financial actor in the Mediterranean world. And that network made him wealthy, not spectacular by the standard of Crassus, but comfortable, propertied, influential, and secure in a way that no amount of solitary effort could have produced. The lesson is permanent. The network is the asset. Before the land, before the contracts, before the loans, build the network. Stage 5. The leverage. Now here is where Roman wealth building gets dangerous, and where the highest returns were generated. Rome understood leverage before the word existed. Leverage in the Roman context was simple. You used someone else's money to control a larger asset than your own capital could purchase. You borrowed at 12% per year. You invested in something that returned 20%. The 8% spread was your profit on the borrowed capital, plus the full return on your own capital. In practice, this meant that a Roman investor with 100,000 sesterces of his own money could borrow another 200,000 and control a 300,000 sesterce position. If that position returned 20%, he made 60,000 sesterces. His own money had effectively returned 60% instead of 20%. The risks were proportional, and Rome was unsentimental about them. If your leveraged investment failed, if the crop was bad, if the ship sank, if the province defaulted on its taxes, you owed the full borrowed amount regardless. Debt in Rome was enforced with a completeness that would make a modern bankruptcy lawyer faint. But the Romans who used leverage intelligently, who borrowed short against assets that generated reliable long-term returns, who diversified so that a single failure couldn't destroy the whole position, those men built wealth at a speed that unleveraged investing could never match. The grain trade was the classic vehicle for leveraged investment. Rome needed to feed its population. At peak, Rome, the city, had 1 million people. Every one of them needed to eat. The state provided free grain to citizens through the annona. But the mechanism that got the grain from Egypt and North Africa to Rome was private. It was merchants who owned ships, who had contracts with grain producers, who negotiated with the aediles who managed grain distribution. Shipping grain from Alexandria to Rome was enormously profitable. It was also enormously risky. Ships sank. Weather could destroy cargo. Pirates could seize vessels. The Romans had a financial instrument to manage this risk called Finis Nauticum. Maritime loans, sea loans. Here's how it worked. A merchant needed to buy grain and charter ships. He borrowed money at extraordinarily high interest, often 30% for a single voyage. If the ship sank, the debt was canceled. That was the lender's risk. If the ship arrived safely, the merchant sold the grain, repaid the loan with the high interest, and kept the profit. The profits on a successful voyage were extraordinary, because the price of grain in Rome, especially in a short year, could be multiples of what you paid in Alexandria. And the merchants who ran multiple voyages simultaneously, who understood weather patterns, who had relationships with reliable ship captains, who could hedge their cargo across multiple vessels, turned grain trading into one of the most profitable businesses in the ancient world. This is the leverage play. High risk, high return, managed through diversification and expertise. Not for everyone, but for the men who understood it, transformative. The freedmen. Now let me tell you about the most dangerous wealth builders in Rome. Not the senators, not the equestrians with their publican companies, the freedmen. A freedman was a former slave who had been manumitted, freed by his master. When freed, he became a Roman citizen of sorts. Not full, not quite equal, but free, and often extraordinarily capable. Because the slaves who became freedmen were not the field laborers worked to death on grain farms. They were the educated slaves. the Greeks who had been captured and enslaved and who often had more education than their Roman masters, the accountants, the secretaries, the doctors, the teachers, the men who actually ran Roman estates and businesses while the masters attended to their social obligations. These men had spent years, sometimes decades, watching exactly how Roman wealth was built and managed. They understood the systems from the inside, and when they were freed, they had the most valuable thing in Rome: human capital, skills, knowledge, relationships. Trimalchio, the fictional freedman in Petronius's Satyricon, is the Roman archetype. He was freed with a little capital from his master. He used it to buy into the grain trade. His first 3 ships sank. He lost everything. He borrowed again, bought more ships, diversified his cargo, and made back everything he'd lost plus a fortune. Then he used that fortune to buy land, which gave him the social respectability that trade could not. At the dinner party in Petronius's novel, Trimalchio is grotesquely, almost comically rich. Petronius wrote him as a satirical figure, a vulgarian, a man who didn't know how to wear his wealth with proper Roman dignity. But beneath the satire is a real phenomenon. The freedmen who understood the system, who had no social constraints against trade, who had been educated inside wealthy households, and who brought fierce ambition to their freedom, were disproportionately represented among Rome's significant new fortunes, because they had something the old money didn't have. They understood that the system had no sentiment. It didn't care about your dignity or your family name or your social position. It rewarded those who understood how it worked and acted on that understanding without hesitation. The final pattern. Now let me show you the sequence that ties everything together, because the individual pieces, the land, the contracts, the lending, the network, the leverage, they're not separate strategies. They're a sequential system, the same system, just applied across different asset classes. It starts with human capital. Before you have any money, you build skills. The skill that Rome valued above all others in commerce was numeracy, the ability to calculate quickly, accurately, and in multiple currencies. Rome traded across a world with dozens of different monetary systems. The man who could convert Egyptian talents to Roman sesterces to Greek drachmas without error was indispensable. He got hired, he got trusted, he got access. From access comes the network. From the network comes information. Which contracts are being auctioned? Which landowners are in financial trouble and might sell? Which merchants need short-term capital and will pay premium rates for it? Information, in Rome as in every economy in history, is the raw material of wealth. From information comes the first investment. Small, conservative. A partial stake in a grain shipment. A small loan to a reliable borrower. A piece of land bought at a discount from a distressed seller. Not spectacular, not transformative, but positive. A return. Capital preserved and grown. That capital is reinvested. Every sesterce of profit goes back to work. Not spent, not displayed. Not used to signal wealth before you have wealth. This is the discipline that separated Rome's great fortunes from its brief ones. Crassus lived simply while he accumulated. Atticus was famous for his personal modesty, even as he lent to the most extravagant men in Rome. The reinvestment compounds. The network expands as your capital expands because capital makes you more useful to more people. You can participate in bigger contracts, offer larger loans, buy more significant properties. And with each step up, your information access improves, your network strengthens, and the compounding accelerates.